of Enterprise Information in the Office of the Secretary of Defense Studies, in which he directs data governance, technical transformation, and shared services efforts to make timely, authoritative acquisition information available to support oversight of the Department of Defense major programs, which is a portfolio totaling more than $1.6 trillion of investment funds over the life cycle of programs. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Finance and a Master of General Administration in Financial Management, both from the University of Maryland. So please join me in welcoming Mark.
Good afternoon. I think I'm on. I just need to be sure. Okay, good. I'm going to stand down here. I think it's pretty much an informal gathering at this point. I'm standing in between, maybe not your lunch, but a beautiful day out there. And I want to thank Parham, because Parham does such a great job, and I know he's not in the room, but I know this will get back to him. He kind of reminds me, walking around with a microphone, and you might date yourself if you remember the Gong Show. Reminds me a little bit of Chucky Barris. He does a really good job. There he is. So I said I would ruin his reputation. You can take me down. I don't need that much echo. But I thank him and his team, because he does such a great job. And no offense to the vendors, it was quite interesting. In one of our roundtables, we had more government than vendors at the table. So I thought that was a good thing of getting some of the government people out. I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes, maybe about 40 or so, hopefully not that long, and give you some opportunity to questions about how we're doing what we're doing and why we're doing it. And a little bit of backdrop. It is a beautiful day. I'd like to remind everybody the last day I remember a day like this was 9/11, over a decade ago. And we are a nation still at war, sometimes with ourselves, but we are a nation at war, and we can't forget that. But I want to talk to you about information management for the Undersecretariat. I have a few charts. You can all have them. Talk to you about tools, techniques, how we're thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I got to find my clicker. I found it. I think we all know in this room that data is the core to all decision making. And it's more than just data, it's really information. And data and information define itself differently. And I have a little bit of a paradigm and an awful lot of acronyms up there, and I'll try to explain this as we go on. We think about it in terms of data authority. I'm pleased to work for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, where the sign outside his door is, "In God we trust, all others bring data." So he is a data-driven individual. So it's a Deming quote for those of you who remember Deming and realize that data is the core of all the decision making. And he presides over, and has the decision authority, over 1.7 trillion of major weapon system programs, and even more when you get to major information programs and when you start to cascade that down in the department. So it's a pretty big portfolio that he has, but we've really tried to break the paradigm. And I know I sat with some architects here and people that have worked in architecture, been around long enough to go from process modeling. We think about it in terms of data, which is the core of the truth in our world of how do you manage decision making in the department. It is about the information. So we have data as the core, and actually with my team, which is a rather small team, and we drive it from data, data transparency, and data authority. You'll hear terms like provenance and other things. We have the distinct privilege in our area, and we're close enough to the E-ring at the Pentagon where we can actually decide what some of the definitions are and remove that ambiguity that seems to multiply with more information. So we put data at the core, but data as the core really works in an environment. And I'll talk, I think, a fair bit about how data at the core. Data works in institutional processes, tribal processes in those institutions, work under policy. We'll talk a little bit about policy. We'll talk about practice of data. And how does that ultimately work in the decision-making process that the Undersecretary finds himself? But data, data transparency, and the core delivery, and it's consistent as it goes through there. So it's about sound information. It's about data, and it's about the ability of the department, not me, to analyze that information. So there's three key tenets, and executives need that. They need the advice of the analysis. There's many institutions that do this. We are talking about a pretty big portfolio. It is not just a system, a program, it's a bunch of programs to make good decisions. So, we've had a lot of help over the years. There's been a lot of laws and legislations that have come up associated with major weapon system programs. You hear the programs in the news, JSF, F-18, all the Army programs, Navy programs, Air Force programs, Missile Defense Agency programs. They're all big programs. There are about 80 or so in the department. I think I'm up to about 1.8. Congress had said that we have to certify those programs or we don't get our money. And those programs are not just programs. Those programs, to draw the link all the way through, are what support our soldiers, sailors, and airmen. They're what keep this nation safe, which keep days like today beautiful and you feeling pretty comfortable inside these borders of working and being safe from foreign enemies here. It mandated MDAPs to manage cost. We talk about it in Nunn-McCurdy breaches. Every time a program breaches this and cost, and you hear it in the news in the 30-second soundbite, where a major weapon system overran a program by $30 million or $30 billion, and what are you going to do about it? It also requires us to report on the major acquisition information systems. You know, they're the big ERPs and big different types of programs that are out there in the Department of Defense. The Undersecretary, about, I want to say 3 weeks ago, also issued a mandate, Better Buying Power 2.0, which is about 30 pages of direction to the department of how he's going to manage, and principally from a workforce perspective, from an information perspective, and what he wanted to change in the Department of Defense so he could move us into this century from where we are. He also has in work right now changing the way we acquire major weapon systems. We affectionately call that the 5000.02. It's the acquisition regulation that drives the acquisition process in the Department of Defense. It's been around forever and describes the roles and responsibilities, and in that, how we manage and oversee programs. Our comments, my comments into that document, where we put some hooks in the policy regulation to better understand and how we manage the data, so we influence the policy as well there. But the Department of Defense can decide the need for that. And it's no great mystery. I think they're on the Hill today, but for a different matter. But when the budget rolls out, when programs go awry, when programs are up there, the Undersecretary's testifying, making sure that he has the right information to go forward with that. We also have to manage a $1.67 trillion program. We also have a lot of institutional practices that we do to use that. And anyone from DOD or former DOD? We got a few. We're exposed to this probably every day of our lives when we're there. We have the Defense Acquisition Board, where the Undersecretary reviews key milestones and related decisions. He's pretty much doing a program review on a major program. We also have the Defense Acquisition Executive Summary, where once a month he convenes 3 of his favorite programs to do a review. Either programs that we don't understand where they're going, they're underfunded. It could be 1,000 reasons why they're in the review. And those programs include MDAPs, Major Defense Acquisition Programs, pre-MDAPs, which is a bit of term of art, and Major Automated Information Systems. And you could be a Major Automated Information System and still be an MDAP. It's all decided by thresholds. So our proposition. What do we do? What's my mission area within the mission area of acquisition within major acquisitions of the Department of Defense? They like to refer to us as the plumbers. We're the ones that make sure the data goes. We're the ones that make sure we get the data. So we live on the simple axiom of providing timely, accurate, authoritative information for the Undersecretary to make his decisions by. We have objectives. Define and govern the data. Big G, not little g. And I'll have a few backdrops. Make data available for all the department to use, not just in a silo across the seam. Data knows no boundary. And provide tools, and this is probably the least part of it, some tools, some techniques, some architecture, some infrastructures to manage that by. So yesterday I had the distinct privilege of briefing one of our governance bodies, which my boss presides over, the Director for Acquisition Resources and Analysis, and she calls it her data forum. But around the table we had all the senior leaders from OSD and acquisition, all the components, Army, Navy, Air Force, DLA, DISA, and we talk about data. We talk about what data we have, what we need to get, why do we need to get it, what their responsibilities are, and how the Department of Defense ultimately gets in somewhat federated for getting that data up. What do we do in this year in 13? What's left to do in 13? Where do we see 14 to come out so we can build our budgets and we can understand and set priorities on what are the most important things in terms of data and information that the Undersecretary needs, that we need, not just him, but us, to manage the data. It really isn't about technology, but technology has a significant underpinning here, whether it be in the analytical spaces, whether it be on the infrastructure and architecture pieces of how do you architect, how do you adapt, how do you deploy in a fast environment. Technology may not be the root cause of it, but is certainly sometimes the bane of my existence. And it's not because we don't know how to use it, and it's not because we don't think about it in cloud. It's about deploying it and ultimately getting it hosted somewhere and make it work across the boundaries that we call the Army, Navy, and Air Force and all the other factions here. Achieving the mission. I'm probably a bit different from most than you've either heard or talked about, because we do come at it exclusively and very pronounced from the missionary, because it's about making decisions in the acquisition community. It's not about technology, it's not about FSMA, it's not about all those interesting pieces, but if we don't have the information, and certainly not to diminish those crafts, not to diminish those roles, it is about the Undersecretary being able to make decisions as quickly as he needs to, defend and argue, and our space is an interesting one. We chose this very deliberately because we knew the E-ring would care about it. So we talk about it in terms of service orientation, we talk about it in business analytics, we talk about it in open APIs, we talk about it in hosting, and try to guide the department in an area where information moves generally at about a 30-day pace. And maybe even longer if I counted some of the services handling of the information where we're trying to get into a program sense. We were deliberate. We didn't want to deal on the supply chain side of this where we're processing 1,000 transactions. We wanted to understand how we were to better manage information, how could we apply those tools and techniques, and how could we keep our customers completely engaged with where we were going. One of the key things, and it happened maybe about a year and a half ago, during the Defense Acquisition Executive Summary for the Undersecretary presides, I get to kick off and I get to grade data. And up there on the predominantly green chart, on the green side of this, I take all the programs, all the data we've asked for, and I say to them, we got it or we didn't get it from the services. It's been profound in the way the Department of Defense manages. So when the Undersecretary is staring you down at a conference room table on the skiff and saying, why didn't I get the Navy's data? It's the Navy's problem to answer that. Or why didn't we get the Army, or why didn't we get the program data? We have changed the way we think about it. It's no longer, well, it's in the system. We're thinking about data as an entity and data that is something that needs to be managed across those places. We also have graded the graders. One of the other charts describes on the programs? Are our analysts analyzing that data? And are they advising the undersecretary? So we're grading to say, did we get the data? Is it good? In my story, and the services have actually been behind us all the way in offering that clarity. My goal is to get them to green. My goal is not to decide. My goal is to get them on the playing field and let them talk about it in terms of decision making, because we are the fuel of that process. We are not the ones that get to say this program lives, this program dies, this one's good, this one's bad. We don't step on the equities of the logisticians, the engineers, the program people. We provide them the data across those seams, and we give them a scorecard. It's been profound because in about a year and a half ago, we were about 70%. The data is now good when we're at the day's review, but I'm not going to lie to you and say it's good the day before. But the services are paying attention. So the components do a good job now trying to fix this, and that in turn means fixing their own institutions and becoming data focused and focused in the area of acquisition, because they know they get scorecarded on that. And it's not my scorecard, it's theirs. So our objective is to get them generally to green, be clear as a department on what data we want, what it means, and how do we do that? We do that with a couple things. One is the acquisition visibility data matrix. It is not a transition plan. We have an AV technical, an acquisition visibility technical data matrix, which describes all the wiring and all the things with that. But with clarity and unambiguity, we say who owns the definitions for those definitions in the department. It sounds small, it sounds trite, but I'm working across the Department of Defense and the senior leader saying, your name is going next to this definition. Is this what you want it to mean? So there are organizations like the Performance and Root Cause Assessment, there's organizations like procurement, there's organizations like engineering. When they talk about reliability growth curve and what data, they define what those data terms are. We get the scorecard, we do their dirty work for them, and we get to measure, but we don't get to decide. We also ask them to determine, at least on an individual basis, what do they think about releasability? Aggregation is a different matter, but on an individual basis, what do they think about it? Because some of this stuff is already in the free and clear. We already know that. In establishing this, we've established specific accountabilities across the department for who gets to define and where the authoritative information comes from. So we don't put it in a proxy, and we don't put it in store, and we don't create the databases, because we want to be compliant with where the Department of Defense is going in terms of shared services, how we keep data, how we manage data, but we have an organization that manages data extensively across that. And that organization is rather small, as I said. A lot of this is based in spreadsheets. The most important thing we had to figure out was the institutions. And sorting out the institutions were no small matter. Now we can adopt technologies. Our technical partner has been Spa War System Center Charleston, or Atlantic, as they're referred to, as well as the OSD-CIO, because we have infrastructure pieces sitting in multiple places. And it would probably confound most that say that they don't always talk to each other, they don't always have the same software, and they don't always have the same framework for you to move and deploy nimbly. It has been actually one of the big issues for us in terms of finding new ways to introduce data management of this century into the department. Where do we think we're going? And the tease I like to put out there is we're thinking about it as a defense acquisition visibility environment. Environment all intentionally chosen as their name. We are the DoD. We are acquisition. We are about making it visible. And we are about an environment and a flexible architecture to move forward. But in short, we're thinking about it as Dave. Creating an environment, because I think we've gotten pretty good at managing how we can go to an app-like environment and deploy capabilities for the Undersecretary when he asks for data. Through strong management and data techniques and techniques that industry can bring, we can move to an app environment, host it in an app-like environment, host that capability, and I'll give you a few backdrops where we've done that, or at least in pilot. In less than 6 weeks, we were able to take the entire Department of Defense's budget, link it to other information, and put it on an Apple iPad that the Undersecretary could walk around. That was all the budget information. It was also consistent, and at the time, we were counseled by our OSD CIO to follow NSA's guidance, and we even managed it to data at rest paradigm by being able to do, as I would say, of being a business guy, double secret encryption. So no data at rest, encrypted pipe, encrypted through the pipe, and maintained at this hosting service. We could do it. We couldn't deploy it. It's because we didn't have enough of an infrastructure to put that on. We're planning to do that by 15. We think we've learned enough in this year that we can provide guidance in working across those pieces here. We know how to better manage it, so next year we'll be setting this up and hopefully working through that. I know somebody did say you have a university study. There was a mention about a university study. I used to have the studies, and we used Penn State for about 6 months to help us understand what the problems were that we would encounter. It was only 6 months. We'll take their product and put it in a practical environment and work with the OSD CIO. The interesting thing about security is we are already federated. We're using this as our security services for identity management. So we do that, but we know that's still not good enough at a data level of management. I would like to get to data level, atomic level of data security, so we would have a better understanding of how to manage that. But we're thinking about it in Dave. One, having a flexible architecture, and we're thinking about our analysts. There's really two communities we serve: decision makers and those that analyze that fuel the decision makers. And those analysts are usually, in many cases, OSD studies, not OSD staff, that have particular matters of what they are focused on in terms of analyzing the information that comes into them. So we're thinking about them from a CAC PKI perspective, putting it in an access so they can have the information what they want. We've also created the mechanism so they can tell what we want, we know what we have. And that way we do it as an institution. And that means we're just not asking for data willy-nilly. We're asking for data that needs to be meaningful, because there's a lot of other data out there that we may or may not need. But we also need a fusion point for us to fuse the data and other data sources that are out there, whether they be Federal Procurement Data System Next Generation, Fed BizOps. There's numerous government sources. There's also industry sources that we can fuse and pull data in. I learned governance is hard. So when I hear governance in most contexts, I have to think about many dimensions. So we think about it as facets of the diamond. And what I've learned with my fellow deputy directors, and I met with them this past week, that there's an awful lot of perspectives on data management, whether they be policy, whether they be practice, whether they be people, whether it be process, whether it be data itself. An interesting thing is the team that I've assembled are really the data scientists, is that they have to consider all of those factors at the same time. Do we understand what technology can bring to the discussion? What do we need to know about an access? What do we need to know about our people? What do we need to know about the policies that are driving this, as well as the processes? Because when we get to data management, all those are informing constructs of what data we're asking for. I've contended, and I don't think there is a lot of research on this, we've started little pieces there, that data has bias. and it has bias based upon the questions you're asking for it, and when you're running it from the Department of Defense perspective, those biases can very much swing you. And then it's ultimately managed in the artifacts and capabilities. We ask those questions of our customers. I usually ask 3 questions. What are you trying to achieve? How do you want to see it? And what data do you want? And those of us in DoD would say that's principally requirements management. So looking across that and saying, do we have that? Do we have it the way you want to look at it, or is it something more that we need to get? We have about 300 or so data elements, so it's not thousands that we're worried about, but you have to be aware of the thousands that you have to worry about. The data universe is rather big. We started with a foothold. We were principally on the major acquisition programs. Anyone familiar with 5002 today? 1. Describes major milestones for major programs. The F-18 was not built in 6 months. Then they have a milestone A, they have a milestone B. When they get to a milestone B, they move to production. When they go to C, they're post-production. Those milestones take years. We had a very good foothold on data from B to C. We didn't know, we had pockets of data existing across the Department of Defense, and anybody familiar with DAU and the Acquisition 5000, there's a chart that's about as big as that one that describes the intricacies of what goes on when you buy a major weapon system. We had pockets of data before that, but none of it really fused. So we're working on getting data earlier in the process, because engineering of a major weapon system ultimately affects the development, procurement, and ultimately the sustainment of those aircraft. We also understand that the Department of Defense has moved, it's not just about the system. The Undersecretary wants to measure the performance of the organization. And what does he mean by the performance of the organization? He means, how are the people performing? How are the institutions performing? How are the processes performing? And ultimately, how are the policies performing? So we created a data universe to think about it. We're focused, as I said, on the major programs. But if you ask the question of how is the Navy performing with all of their programs, and you only have this piece of data, the question is, will that data answer that question? Or do we need other data sets? So we think about it as an environment of how do you walk through this, and we also have a map of where we see other pockets of data, other silos of data sitting across the Department of Defense. Some on the high side, some on the low side, some of them managed by different institutions. But we have a map because when we want to think about it, when the Undersecretary asks that, you can't do everything all at once. There is no big bang. Which ones are the greatest priorities, and we'll go get the data and bring it in for you. So we know what we have, we know what we don't have. I have more demand on data and management of data than I could ever finish probably in the next 3 years. And I think that's a good problem to have. That says that, to me, that the department is moving into a data information age of managing it, and their demands of applying these styles and techniques and strategies for deployment are well-founded. And in other words, and what we often say, commercial best practice, we're fully committed for this year and next year. Money doesn't necessarily solve all problems. We find ourselves thinking about it that we need talent within the government workforce. We're training people handcrafted to become data scientists, become data analyzers. We're pushing and pulling on the organizations that we can move forward with that. Customers want more all the time because it drives efficiency, it drives effectiveness in their organizations. So our customer base, we were in a room and probably had 50 people in there. We were like, when we first started out a couple years ago, we didn't have that. So we have a degree of synergy now. Now they want more, now we're forced to deliver. In capturing those customers, in our case, you know, we like to be the lazy bureaucrat, but I'm not a capture manager, but I know if I capture the information for that, the Department of Defense can move horizontally where out of the silos. So in one small area where it comes to acquisition information, we can manage that pretty thoroughly. We do have a couple key points, though. We have a system, it's called DAMR. The system becomes proxy for what they mean in terms of requirements management. I never really like talking about systems much, but systems are where people really touch a keyboard. That has all the acquisition oversight structured data. This past year, we stood up AIR, the Acquisition Information Repository, DTIC. So down at Fort Belvoir, different from the OSD, so I've challenged with federating data sources now. But that has about 1,000 or so unstructured documents that the Department of Defense uses for all its major acquisitions. So about 200 or so documents. So we didn't go back and collect and pull it out all of the file cabinets. As programs go through their reviews, they're required, and I can measure that, are there documents going up there? It's both on the high and the low side. One of the requirements we have right now, working with Christopher Thomas down in DTIC, is to put advanced search on those capabilities. So let me do some natural language processing on, can I type this in and can I get my returns? Because pretty soon we have repositories and then we could start to look left and right across that. Data governance is the key. Availability is going to be a bit problematic, and I think we're going to have to work through that. What does available mean and to whom? 1.7 trillion. We get the wrong data in the wrong hands, people would be concerned. We need to be thoughtful and provocative on that. I don't think our policies address all that in terms of it. We handle it from a security and a physical security sense, but we don't handle it from an intellectual sense. We kicked off a study. I went to RAND this year, went with PARCA, Performance Assessment and Root Cause Analysis, as well as CAPE, which is the cost assessment people we've tri-sponsored, looking at our policies and processes to sort that out and figure out what we need to do. Because many of our laws, regulations were not built in an information age, they were built in an industrial age where information was siloed. And ultimately, data analyst support. We were talking about it at one of our tables, and one of my contentions are, we need to grow a cadre of analysts, more than what we have. It's not just fire and forget, put a statement of work out and have somebody analyze the data. You need to understand how people analyze it. You heard my background, it's in financial management. If somebody gives you the answer and says it's a good deal, how do you know it's a good deal if you don't know some of the underpinnings? And a lot of information we've been stuck a little bit in reporting, not analyzing. So we need to grow our people in that, and I know that's been a big plank for the Undersecretary to get DAU to move in that perspective as well, too. We see the future really in a flexible architecture and a flexible framework. I also see the institution with some core values where data is at the management, it's centralized in terms of its management. Not completely, but appropriately. I think acquisition is one of those categories, and being a career civil servant, I would suspect that it needs to be in career hands for a period of time. Because you just can't divorce yourself from that. Somebody's got to know where the information is and how it gets put together. Need not be a big team, but it should be well-resourced and a part of the fabric of the department. My ambitions are weak at best. I'm not shooting for the Undersecretary. I'll be glad to retire out of here in 10 years and say, this is what we did. We brought data to the century. Let the honorables make those decisions. So it's not a play to move to that job. It's a play to have the institution built into the organization. Need not be a big one, but it better be a good one. And that's what we're trying to do with that. And I'll be glad to take any questions and get you out of here. And yeah, it was about 40 minutes, 38. You're all full from the pizza, I know. The pizza was good. Yes, sir. Yes. I have Charleston, well, I'll start with the last first. We're getting into the workflow tools to manage the data more appropriately. We had to get our heads around what we really need to manage, and I found that hugely problematic. To answer your first question, the services have thrown in with us because that's their promise. The data calls stop. So, the tool and technique here is, here's the data we want. Do you agree with that? Speak now or forever hold your peace. And I don't care if you get it to me SneakerNet, or you get it to me web services, or you're on a true publish and subscribe, I grade it. So we've incentivized them in many ways to say, go to publish and subscribe. I don't want to mess with your infrastructure. You put it on the dock, I'll pick it up when I want. Sometimes they don't want you to have the data, though. So you get institutional prerogatives around that, but we have the undersecretary to cover them for that. The question is, on the other data calls, what that means is the organization also has to change. So I think about it as Amazon.com. Here's where you come in. You want to buy a book? I'll give you the data. We turned all our data sources to open APIs, so I'll give it to other people. We're not trying to sit on it. So when somebody says, I need acquisition data, I say, here's what I have. You want this? Federate it. They can fuse that in with other data sets, because I'm not going to be able to ever exhaustively answer every piece of data. But I know if I can answer a piece of data and find my point out, find my points in, and manage that within an inch of its life, it will cut down on data calls. And they are turning. The services just briefed us yesterday as a part of that, saying, yep, we're in. And in some cases, one service that'll go nameless and say, if you're doing it, I'm going to stop. You know, I just don't have the money. Now, the other two services, that's the way we usually count in threes. They're like, well, I have my own. Oh, okay, that's fine too. You can set your own path to success here. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
How that's defined, how DoD defines authoritative?
That there is only one person that can own that definition, but we do have a context. It's acquisition. Cost. Comptroller has a definition for cost, but the use case is different. So under the use case of acquisition, we say this is what the acquisition community means. Now, there is a policy memo that's soon to coming out. It's in current staffing. Co-signature between Comptroller and AT&L that says when we say cost, it's going to mean this both places. We're not there yet. So we put it in the context of acquisition because we operate under the specific authorities under the AT&L. We say, what data do you want? Flyaway cost means this. Who gets to define it? And we're close enough to the E-ring where we could sort out and say, sir, it's your job. That's going in formal coordination this next 2 weeks. So we define specifically the definition of what the meaning is. We were a little bogged down because when you start weeding through the regulation and policies and practices, you can come up with a dozen answers for some of that stuff. You just can't break apart the FMR, break apart FAR and DFAR and the Acquisition 5000 and come out with a decent definition. In some cases you can, but not often. So we worried more about who and what institution defined the authoritative data. Then we asked the services. I heard accountability mentioned. Where do you want me to get that from? And when they said my system, we said, no, we're just a pass-through. I know for the Damer system, for acquisition program baseline, it is the authoritative source for acquisition program baseline information. It's set by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, adopted by acquisition, it's housed in Damer. So when I get costs from a program, we ask the services, and the answer is, shouldn't we get it from the PM? We start there. And in some cases, their prerogatives will sit there and say, well, no, you need more than that. Here's where I went and did it. But they're the ones sitting around the table have to answer the question, red, yellow, green, did they give it to me? So we didn't worry about providence of trying to fish out of there and saying, we queried 30 systems and this one looks the best. We said, no, where is it? Because that helps sort it out. We have a very interesting problem and a dilemma. And I'll touch on that, if I may, on that diamond that we talked about. Earned value management. The Department of Defense, we have an authoritative source of earned value management. It's called EVM Central Repository. It's built, it's under the PARCA. It was tried to be institutionalized 4 or 5 years ago under Ken Krieg, then under Secretary of Defense. I've been getting earned value management from the programs, because I had to put it in our data model to make sense of it. Well, it was decided 2 weeks ago. You're not going to get 39 data elements from the services anymore. And I told that to them yesterday. We're going to get it from EVMCR. That means their processes and the way they think about the data may have to evolve. Because we're talking about pretty big institutions at this point. Because I'm going to still have to get a PM estimate on their earned value. I'm going to keep it at level 1, because anything short of level 1 data of earned value, and it leaks, I got a problem, mission control, subject to the Trade Secrets Act, and all the industry would be upset. So we'll keep it at a level 1, moving across that. But the PM estimate, when does it occur? Because right now, the PMs give me an estimate every 45 days. Earned value management moves every 30 days. So PARCA, performance assessment, has to sort that out and provide guidance to us, because when it's in front of the undersecretary, he's not going to care about all those little nuances of how data was handled. But we told the services, we're turning. You need to account for that, and please adjust your citing for that. So that's how we think about authoritative data. Other question? Yes, sir.
You alluded to a couple times this idea of a data scientist. I was kind of curious of what your definition of it is, and are you thinking like a quant or somebody like that, or are you thinking about something more of just a generic data analysis? And how would you compete to get that talent, because it's typically very expensive? They go to Wall Street and do other things like that.
Yeah. I don't know. I read the papers. I think it's certainly, there's a range. I'd probably be fooling myself in saying I'm one, but I know where most of the data is in the Department of Defense. But am I one to analyze all the pieces there? No, that is not my institution. That is not my aspiration. That's somebody else. And yes, that is expensive. Depending on the sector. I mean, we have institutions that are built out of analysis houses, both commercially as well as FFRDCs, as well as internal to the department. Yes, they are expensive. Some of them are worth a mint. I know most of them aren't worth a damn on telling you what data they really want and telling you how to find the authoritative sources of that. So it is a craft. So I had an ops research guy who knew more about the data but could never make it actionable for me to crack the code of the Department of Defense. I could hear theories of why it was turning that way, and at some point you still didn't have the data. So there are degrees of data scientists in there, and I see it in the papers these days, but it's people that are smart about data, but they're going to fall in different categories. And I think about it, we mentioned BI. I want people that understand why the data behaves the way it does, not to analyze the data and say what effect does that have on the processes. That's a different question. It requires a different set of skills. I'm only after maybe layer 1 of data scientist analytics. But getting someone to wrap their heads around the Department of Defense and realize that there's 37 institutions at best, and counting at it, 3.8 million people, and people carry guns, drive tanks and planes, and will do anything to protect their institutions of breaking down data. That's a data scientist of understanding managed data. Having someone to understand that an aircraft carrier with its 1 billion moving parts, that you may be subjected to titanium pitfalls, is a very different matter. So it's going to fall in very different degrees. And I think we're going to need both. But I know the second can't do their jobs real well without the first trying to help them get there. And it won't be everything they need. They will have to mine other data sources. Good question, though. Thank you. Another question. It is a beautiful day. Parham, back to you, Chuck. Thank you all for your time and attention.